Welcome to Off the Shelf. I'm your host, Yvonne Wolf. Today, our special guest is Lois Farley Shuford. She wore many hats at the Medill School of Journalism at the Northwestern University, including being the coordinator for the International Residency Program for graduate students. Welcome, Lois.
Thank you, Yvonne. It's a pleasure to be here.
What motivated you to write this book, Finding Home, an Irish-American Story?
Actually, I think of myself as an accidental author. I really never set out to write a book. What happened was I was mesmerized by a photograph that I saw at a family reunion when I was about 20 years old. And the photograph was of an older man sitting in a rocker with a big book on his lap. And I realized I didn't know who he was. So I asked, who is this person? And was told that this is my great-grandfather. I didn't really know very much about him from our family, but there was something about his eyes, something about his face that just intrigued me. And although I was young at the time and didn't really follow up on it very much at that point, later in life, after I was married and our children were grown, I set out to try to find his path in life.
Well, being curious about an ancestor is very common, I would say, but when was the time you knew you must write this book?
Well, actually, the book, as I said, I hadn't intended to really write a book. What I was doing was searching for his story. So I was doing quite a bit of research, and I had kind of adopted the role, or been given the role, of family historian in our larger family from my aunt, who had done it before me. So that involved trips, many trips to Ireland.
That must be fun.
Yes, that is a wonderful thing. We go about every other year. But I spent quite a bit of time tracking down his story. And I had accumulated a lot of material in doing this. I had kept journals on our travels. I had lots of research notes. I had photographs. I had for a short time, I did a little blog. But a very good friend of mine, who has also written a book, said to me, I have this obsession with this man, and I can't seem to let it go. And she was wonderful in reframing that and said, maybe it's not an obsession, maybe it's a calling, which was a very helpful way of thinking about it. And so as the shutdown for the pandemic came, she said, you know, you have all this material. Maybe now is a time to do something with it.
So it took its form during COVID. You didn't have a structure? Or
I really had, just perhaps the year before COVID, I had actually worked for a short time with a writing coach, a woman who I met through off-campus writers workshop up in Winnetka.
Yes.
And she taught writing at Loyola at the time and works as a writing coach. And I gave her some of the material that I had and said, what is this? What is this? What could this be?
Yes.
And she said, you know, I think it could be a book. And so we met a few times. She read through what I had, which was in chunks of, done over long periods of time, different periods of time. So
handwritten, some of it, probably typed some other parts.
Yes, exactly. Yes, notes, right, exactly. Some on the computer, some by hand. And she was very good in helping me think through how it might evolve, how it might be put together.
Yes.
And was particularly helpful, and I'm grateful for this so much, in telling me that I needed to put myself in the story more. That people will care about the story only if they care about you, the storyteller, especially in a book that's narrative nonfiction, which this is. It's not historical fiction.
So it's called narrative
nonfiction, creative nonfiction. There's a number of terms that people use for that. But I didn't want to write as I had all the information. I didn't want to fictionalize it. It could have been, it could have been a historical fiction story. But I felt that as I thought about it, I didn't want anyone fictionalizing my life, and I'm not sure I wanted to do that to one of my ancestors, although certainly one could.
So this man never came to the United States.
Yes, he did come to the
He
United
did?
States.
Okay, so
yes.
he is
So what I learned,
sojourner,
as I
perhaps,
began to learn about him, was that he was our first immigrant ancestor in the Farley family. He came at the end of the Great Famine, which is often referred to as the Potato Famine.
Yes,
From Ireland in
a huge migration.
huge
Irish
migration that really ran from the famine itself from 1845 to 1851 or 52. He came to the U.S. as a teenager at the end of that time.
I see.
Yes, and then eventually fought in the American Civil War. Eventually went back to Ireland. Actually, came back with his wife. We married someone there, came back with his wife, started their family in New Haven, Connecticut, in the urban area, which is typical for at the time. And then eventually that family went west. So what intrigued me was the idea of ordinary people living through these epic, cataclysmic times.
Oh, yes.
And what was it like for them? So
Yes, they're part of the history. Right, their lives they lived through.
Yes, exactly. They were part of the history, but they aren't the names and the dates in the books, right?
Yes.
They're the important people.
And they probably were unaware. They're just the timing of
Of
it,
course,
right?
yes, absolutely, absolutely.
Yes. And I also agree that many times immigrant stories aren't so linear. You think they just came once, but then no, they came twice, and then 3 times, and then they perhaps eventually retired back in the home country. So this is all very, very hard to trace. Or
it can be very hard to trace.
Follow, let's say.
Yes,
right?
exactly. And it can be quite different for various immigrant groups. The Irish at the time of the Great Famine that came tended not to go back at all. I know Italians made frequent trips, but the Irish tended not to come back. I think it was so traumatic, what they had lived through, that they didn't want to. So the fact that Patrick, his name was Patrick Farley, went back after his 5 years in the Army. He was not a volunteer. He had signed up for the regular Army before the war began, and then of course was caught in the war, and went back. Literally, he was on a boat leaving the United States for Ireland as Gettysburg was happening, was just beginning, or I wouldn't be here to tell this story, I think.
Wow.
Yeah.
And how did you decide on this cover?
On the cover?
Yeah, this looking out from a
looking out through the window?
Right.
I had a wonderful editor, and she helped me find a wonderful design team. All the photographs in the book are photographs that I have taken. So I knew that I wanted a title that conveyed the concept of looking for home, looking for belonging, finding home. So I chose about 3 different photographs that I had taken in Ireland that I thought might help convey that. And this one with the window view was my favorite, and she also hers. And then she worked to set it up so that it has the dark background, and the window, the view out the window shines out.
That's the light.
Yeah, it's actually from a cottage in County Cork in Ireland, which has nothing to do with my family.
Right, but then it has that view of the water setting off.
Yes,
right,
exactly.
Boat.
Yes.
And many times, as I understand these immigrant stories, they didn't perhaps know they were going to the United States.
Absolutely.
They just get on a boat and
right.
You see where you end up.
Right, and the Great Famine immigrants had 2 choices, really, 3 sometimes, but mostly Canada or the United States.
Yes.
And the boats to Canada were run and owned by England. Boats to the United States were from the United States. They were a little bit better regulated than the boats that went to Canada. Yeah. So if you could slightly afford passage, which was a whole thing in itself, usually money sent from others, as it is today,
true.
To help you come.
And if you can read, it's right. If he could read, that is a a huge advantage.
Many people that came at that time from Ireland could not read. Mostly, you're talking about rural
Right, right.
people who would live simply in the country, though some
Farmers,
were from
yeah.
cities, but mostly. And education was, for Irish Catholics at the time, sparse, if not unavailable, unless you went to one of what was called hedge schools, which were sort of secret secret schools where someone was going to help you learn to read and write. So my guess is that he may or may not have been literate when he came over.
At that time.
At
yes,
that time.
Because he was a teenager. And,
Exactly.
Yeah.
But then certainly learned to read, and certainly the Army, once you're joining the Army, then of course literacy is very important.
Yeah, that's so
Yeah.
interesting because
Yeah.
so many of the immigrant stories, like I've interviewed people who came from Greece and they didn't perhaps understand any English,
Yeah.
and they made trips back and forth, or
Right.
my own family, it's in, many of the Chinese American immigration stories are also they I just
yeah.
don't know where they end up. They could be in Tennessee, I mean,
Oh
they
my
could
goodness. Yeah.
be Central America with the boats that just don't know where they will be.
My goodness.
So-
Yes. Yes.
So fascinating. How
It
did
is.
you decide though to self-publish? That is your
Yes,
decision,
I did
right?
self-publish. I felt that at my age, I didn't want to spend 5 years looking for an agent, looking for a publisher, to go the classic publishing route. I looked at several hybrid publishers, and there are some good ones out there.
Oh, what is a hybrid?
A hybrid publisher is a way of doing this so that you actually have some support, some help. So you pay a chunk of money, and it can be as much as 10,000 more.
Wow.
And they have editors and they have design people all there. The one that I was most interested in had a 2-year wait to vet the books. And I thought, I don't have 2 years. I'm not waiting 2 years. And then I spoke to a friend of ours who was in publishing for a while. And he said, Lois, you should just do it yourself. He said, you'll have all the control. You'll pick the editor you can work with. You'll pick the best design team. You'll have total control. So that's what I did. And it is not an inexpensive project. I'm now trying to think of it, reframing it in my mind as sort of a graduate tuition.
Yes, if you think of it that
Right,
way.
right.
Yes.
But I did find a wonderful editor who helped me find a good design team. And
MFA.
and
Yes.
exactly,
That's your
yes, and then helped me go through the process of now we have the book, and now what? So we sent it for distribution and printing to Ingram, which is the largest book distributor in the world. That means anyone can get it. A library can request it, a bookstore can request it. And also we did a separate one through Amazon. So the books are identical, except one of them says Amazon on the back and one says Ingram on the back.
Wow. So you have two. So that's what you mean by hybrid, or
No,
this is
no,
just-
no. The hybrid publishers are companies that help you publish, but they choose the editors, they choose the design team, and that's what I, in the end, did not do. I wanted the ability to choose my own editor and designer, and I'm very, very glad that I did it the way I did it. I think it looks.
When we hear about the cost of self-publishing, I know other authors, even with a children's picture book, it's
Yes.
around $2,000 to $3,000. So
Yes.
I guess this is just probably something that authors should have in mind.
I think so. And I think if you're right, a children's picture book that's often at least that much. I have a cousin who's done some wonderful children's books, and she's done them totally through Amazon. But I wanted to not only do it through Amazon, I wanted bookstores, independent bookstores,
Yes.
which I'm a great believer in, to be able to get this book on their own without going necessarily through an online. So it's available online as a Kindle or an iBook or the actual paperback as it is on your shelf here.
I see, yes. Well, that sounds like a journey worth a whole interview for.
Yes, it's true. It's true.
So what is the value, do you feel, of sharing one's family history?
Yes, that has been a great gift of actually doing this work and writing this book. that I think it's clarified in my mind why it matters. I've even done a little talk recently at the Irish American Heritage Center on telling our stories and why it matters to know them. I think there's three main reasons. One, of course, is to honor the ancestors and their lives, because these people, for all of us have ancestors who have really remarkable stories. And it's important to remember.
They do.
They do.
Yeah, and
Yes.
they had to make some difficult decisions.
They surely did, yes, and they still do today. The second part, and that's more like they sure do today, is that it gives us a real sense, I believe, of connection to everyone, that we are all one family. That learning our own stories and our own ancestors' stories and struggles and challenges and victories helps us to see the struggles of ancestors today. And the actual events of the 19th century just echo so loudly today.
Yes, yes.
You know,
The
divisiveness
division, yes.
and the massive migration and war and epidemic and all, I could go on.
Yes.
The third reason that I believe it's important is that it gives you a sense, it can give you a sense of resiliency and
Faith.
and perspective on the world today. As I was doing the research, I discovered a research project that was done by a couple, Marshall Ward and his wife Robin Fivish, who are psychologists at Emory. And they did this work in the summer of 2001. And they were interested in, there was a lot of material on the dissolution of the family.
Yes,
and
yes.
a
The
lot of sort of
nucleus
negative.
family and
yes, exactly.
And
So they
divorce being something of a 20th century, but
Exactly.
it's not true, right? Yeah.
So their interest was, well, what about the families that aren't falling apart? What's the core there? What's happening? So they interviewed families and children, particularly, I think they were middle school, high school kids. And they had a little series of questions called, Do You Know? And they were questions like, do you know where your grandparents came from? Do you know how your family met? Do you know an incident or a situation that was a hard time or a tragedy in your own family? So they had all this, they asked children these questions, and they had this information. That was the summer of 2001. And then September 9/11 happened, 2001. So they went back to those families and those children and talked to them about this big national tragedy that had just happened and how they were handling it. And they found that the children that scored highly on their Do You Know list were the most resilient and the most future-looking, the most secure in their own self-esteem, because they had an intergenerational sense of themselves. So that was fascinating, I thought, just fascinating.
That is. I can see what you mean, that their identity was not just superficial, but something that has solid foundation.
Yes, exactly.
Based on their family history.
It is a better understanding of how we are networked together and through generations.
It's fascinating because I'm very moved by this as well, because when you mentioned that your Patrick was part of war, I recently did a program about my aunt who was who lived through World War II in China, which is a much longer turmoil.
Yes.
But that idea is also, how do you take that? You know, how do you relate to that experience?
Exactly, and it gave me the sense and perspective that yes, things today in this world today are difficult, but my goodness, they've been much more difficult before. And my great-grandfather came out at the end of his life, which involved a lot of challenge and a lot of tragedy, really, and saying that I am satisfied with the path that fate set out for me. And his outlook on life, I thought, was remarkable for someone who lived through the famine and the war, and then the challenges in moving west and lost some of their children and epidemics, and his wife had some major struggles here.
Lois, your Right. Our ancestors who have gone through death of their own children and famine and war, it's remarkable that they had faith in the life they have, and they don't complain about it.
Absolutely. Yes, it is. It is. It gives us such a perspective, I think, on today,
Yes.
and a much broader perspective on the entire world.
But one can say that society has changed somewhat because in Patrick's environment, everyone has experienced death of their own children. You see,
That's right.
that was very common, and I don't know how people, right, can live through that.
That's very true. And in his case, it was an influenza epidemic in the late 1800s,
Yeah.
where they lost two of their children. And then there's in the book really is a weaving of journeys. It's Patrick's journey, obviously, from Ireland to here and through life, and my journey in finding his journey, and also just the journeys, the national journeys of Ireland and of the United States, including all that history of including things like epidemics and how people tried to deal with it at the time.
And as they can, right?
Yes, and as I was writing this, it was in the middle of the COVID shutdown, and the parallels were just astounding to me.
So what was one difficulty? I know it's going to be hard for you to zoom in on one, but what was one difficulty you did not anticipate in writing this book?
That's a hard question to answer. Because I hadn't set out to write a book, but then that's where it led. I would say that the one difficulty that I didn't expect was the whole concept of putting myself in the story, which was challenging. But as it turned out, it was exactly the right thing to do, and pulls the story together, because it was a searching on my own point from myself of looking for a sense of home myself, a sense of belonging, and how I fit into the world. I'm a child of the 60s and 70s, and also in my own a nuclear family. I'm very late in the game. I had sisters who were 15 and 19 years older than me, and then a big gap. So I always felt a little bit disconnected. And so this story, and Patrick himself, really helped me find in my own journey my own sense of belonging and of home. And that was really
where
important.
you fit in.
Exactly.
That's amazing.
Exactly.
I have a different thought on that take, because I don't look anything like my father. So as a child, I never thought, oh, there's something that I wasn't like my sister who looked like my father. And then I had my first child, and he had the same years as my father. So I just thought, well.
There you go.
Yes.
Right, exactly.
No more self-arguing.
Right, absolutely, absolutely. Yeah.
So how do you have a website, and how do you manage your website?
I do have a website. I had a little bit of help with, I have worked on websites before, but I'm not a designer. So I used a company called Squarespace, and that was a very easy website, similar to WordPress, to put together. So I have a friend who's very good at this, and I just had her sit on the couch next to me as I did it, and get a little help from her that way. But the website is called antoberbooks.com, ANTOBARBOOKS.com. It's Antober means the well in Irish.
Okay. Lois, what kind of advice do you have for writers out there? Someone who's also trying to put together their family history.
I would say for people interested in doing something with the information they have about their family history is this. The computer, what's online is very helpful. Computers are wonderful, and the online companies like Ancestry and others are terrific in giving you factual information. But get out of the house. Find a way to go to the places if you possibly can. And that means both in this country and beyond, if you're able to. Find the cheapest time you can go to visit your family of origin and visit. There is nothing like standing in the place to have a real sense of what your family came from.
I hear also that a lot of local museums never put anything digitally out.
That is true, exactly. And also, there are people in those locations that if you ask around, who's the person that really knows the history of this little bitty place that I'm visiting? There's always someone. And go ahead, call them up, go out and have a cup of tea with them, and you'll learn so much. And you'll have a wonderful experience doing it.
Yes, and the oral tradition is still
Exactly.
the best resource.
Yes, it is. Yeah.
And do you have a message for our writers?
Yes. For writers, yes, two things. One, it is never too late to follow what's in your heart. And if you've got a story in there that's been burning in your brain and wants to come out, it's never too late. So go for it. The other is just to surround yourself. Find a few friends and acquaintances that you highly respect, good readers and possibly writers, but especially people who are good readers, and use them for support and for feedback. That turns out to be quite invaluable.
Well, thank you, Lois, for being here today.
It's been a real delight. Thank you so much, Yvonne.
And thank you for watching. Join us next time on Off the Shelf.